Hello and welcome to the Business Today Most Powerful Women Awards. We are living in what's being called the age of artificial intelligence. This is an era where machines are increasingly smarter than men and women, and more importantly, they're getting smarter with every passing month, and we're staying at roughly the same place. So, how should leaders thrive in the era of AI? To talk about this and more, we're joined by one of Harvard Business School's top professors on leadership and entrepreneurship in emerging markets and HBS's sharpest voice on South Asia. Please join me in welcoming to the Business Today Most Powerful Women Awards, Professor Tarun Khanna. Can we have a warm round of applause, please? Professor Khanna, welcome. Since the time ChatGPT started making waves across the world, a lot of attention is focused on how we've now entered the era of artificial intelligence. And that's making many people wonder, how does that impact what all of us do going into the future? How does this impact leadership of companies, of organizations? Can you help us get started at the Most Powerful Women Awards by talking about how you think people, corporate leaders, should be adapting to the changes that are now upon us?
First of all, Rahul and team, thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here. This is an amazing event, one we've followed over the years, and kudos to all of you. I don't even know where to start. It's such a systemic, foundational change. So I'll take a stab at many dimensions of difference. The first thing to realize is something. So let me talk about AI and ChatGPT for a second and then broaden the conversation to really a dramatic set of technologies that are emerging, all of which have implications for leadership around the world, but perhaps more so in emerging markets like India. When you think about these models, as many of you will know, they are trained on pre-existing data sets. Right? So the ability for them to give you answers or lay out the contours of answers to tough questions depends on them doing basically a form of pattern recognition from past data. The problem is that the past data, to put it crudely, have been put together by men in the context of this. And men have systematically, not intentionally necessarily, but systematically been less conscious about getting representative data sets. Therefore, the data are, in a sense, I'm speaking very roughly and approximately, so excuse the imprecision, but very approximately, the data sets are not representative of the full range of human potential. So I think the first thing that leaders need to realize is that before they rely on quote-unquote answers that are put out or suggestive answers that are put out, they should interrogate carefully what the source is from which the answers are being learned and extrapolated. So that's the first thing. More generally, I would say an issue with all new technologies, and within this, it's not just AI. It's, if you ask me what's an equally profound change that's going on that we don't talk about, and you guys should talk about in the media a lot more, is something like genome sequencing. Right? The cost of genome sequencing is falling at a rate much faster, exponentially faster than Moore's law. And everything that we have here, from my phone, which is effectively a supercomputer that I'm walking around with, to the computation that's going on, the media that's happening around here, is driven by Moore's law. Moore's law, of course, is named after Gordon Moore, who sadly passed away last week. But even relative to that, genome sequencing is advancing at a much more rapid rate. So you can imagine how this understanding of biology, which is again, by the way, connected to data, which will connect to AI and ChatGPT and this and that. So these are all interlinked. Those changes are so profound that I don't think any of us have quite comprehended this. We can talk some more about it, but I think we need the full complement of human experience to engage with these technologies. And to the extent that organizations are leaving out women historically, as you rightly said or your colleague rightly said in the opening comments, it's still a work in progress. We have a lot to celebrate, but it's still a work in progress. We need to actively make sure that all segments of society are represented around the table to deal with this. I'm an optimist, so for me, everything is glass is half full rather than half empty. So think about the potential that we could unlock if we have everybody around the table.
That's at a very macro level in terms of the challenges and the opportunities that the change per se brings. But bringing it down to an individual level in terms of planning careers, in terms of planning lives, at a time when you've got machines which could potentially take away a lot of the jobs that human beings have had so far, what would be your recommendation to people sitting here in terms of how they should be planning the next 10, 20 years to stay one step ahead of being disrupted by the tech curve?
First of all, I would say don't be afraid. It's not a constructive emotion, in my view. It's possible, without being expert, to be aware of the possibilities around it and recognize that the broad sweep of human experience, every time we've been scared of a new technology, well, I shouldn't say every time, but the vast majority of times, the new technologies have ended up generating as many new opportunities as have been competed away or disrupted, or whatever the word is that you want to use. So I'm optimistic that this will free up, both allow sort of the man-machine or the woman-machine interface is likely to be a more productive one than simply the human being doing it. So I would say embrace it rather than run from it.
You do a lot of research on entrepreneurship. If you were to break that up in emerging markets to focus more squarely on women entrepreneurs and give your key takeaways from what you've learned through your body of work in terms of what you think women entrepreneurs are getting right, what do you think they're not getting right, and what could potentially be the way forward?
So I would say the big picture is not that different from, just to caricature, let's say, Silicon Valley and Bangalore. Okay? I don't think it's that different vis-a-vis women being underrepresented in entrepreneurship, risk capital being disproportionately less allocated to women in both societies. For those of you who have any awareness or exposure to Silicon Valley, there have been a wave of scandals in the last few years talking about explicit discrimination against women, lack of capital going towards women. So at least there's a recognition of this. So at some macro level, sadly, the pattern is not that different, whether it's an emerging market or not. I would say, if anything, it's exacerbated, worsened in the developing countries, where we don't yet have the formal institutions built up to promote sections of society that have been relatively left out in the past. Whereas in the US or developed societies, you can go to the courts and this and that and get some redress, at least in theory. So the patterns are the same. They're a bit worse in countries like India than they would be in the US. And this is there's so many levels at which this is costly. The first thing is biases in decision making. Right? There's some really good research from one of my colleagues published in the very prestigious journal Science, Rem Kenning. And he and his team show that women entrepreneurs, women inventors are far likelier, statistically likelier, to a significant extent, to develop products for women. Right? So think about that for a second. To the extent that you are surrounded by just one demographic, males in this instance, and the women are left out, you're probably leaving money on the table because you're not identifying opportunities that would be much more obvious to someone who's had a different lived experience. And I suspect that translates into different disenfranchised communities, not just women and men. So that's a big deal. That's, rupees or dollars on the table that can be corrected. And the smart money is paying attention to it now.
Okay, let's talk a bit about leadership styles, because this is a lot about women and their leadership styles, and your observations through the research that you've carried out on what advice you would possibly give to try and hone leadership styles, and where you think women actually do a better job of leading teams than men do.
Oh, so I'm not an expert on this at all. My suspicion is there's a lot more empathy. What I do feel comfortable saying is that, so I'm an academic primarily, but I'm also an entrepreneur. I start many companies and nonprofits. And my own personal lived experience, not so much my formal research, my personal lived experience is that having very diverse teams around us is far more helpful. One of the companies I'm building right now with one of my students is a nationwide network of tea chains, Chai Point. And clearly having women around in the management team gives you an entirely different experience of the very simple daily, very Indian act of drinking chai, dozens of times in the course of a week, maybe multiple times in the course of a day. So I think just having that perspective is sort of very helpful. I don't have anything to say systematic about the research side of this.
Well, one of your areas of expertise is a comparative between India and China. So if we spend some time over there, given the winds that are playing out in both these countries at this moment, and given where India and China stand just at this second, how do you see the next few years play out? We've seen a lot of international commentary by the likes of Morgan Stanley and the others, which talk about how India could potentially be the third largest economic power in the world by the end of this decade. Is that certain to come true? Could that come true? How are you seeing this play out?
Nothing is certain. Could it come true? Absolutely, emphatically. I'm a big India bull. One way to think about it is that India, I think, demographically, and this is a certainty. This next statement is a certainty. It's not a conjecture. Demographically, the next 20, 25 years are going to be what China just finished in the last 25 years. And that population surge of youth coming into the workforce, so the ratio of working age to non-working age population is going to peak for India in a way that it did for China 25 years ago. Now, if you look at simple statistic like how fast the economy has grown, China has grown at 8-9% per year for 30-odd years, taking the long-run average. We've grown at barely, 4 or 5 or something like that, if that. But the good scholarship, the statistical scholarship, thinks that a significant portion of that 8% growth is due to the demographic bulge, or was enabled by the demographic bulge. So what that says going forward is that China has some tough times coming because they are now aging rapidly. It's the first society that's getting old before it got really rich. In human history, as far as we know. And India has, a tremendous wind in its sails if we don't mess it up.
It's because you work as a consultant in different projects of this government. If you were to look at what you think we're getting right at this moment, and what is it that you think is not going right, which you'd like sitting on the outside for the government and for companies to really fix, what would you highlight?
Oh, so this is something I'm a stuck record on over and over again, but let me restate the one big plus and the one big minus that I see going forward. I think the big plus is, thanks to some, far-reaching thinkers, many of whom you would have heard of, Nandan, for instance, doing Aadhaar, and the iSprit team in Bangalore and so on. We've arrived, we meaning society has arrived at this collective conception of digital public goods. The notion being that our highways are not owned by any individual. We're all free to use our roads. The digital highways, which are going to be so important to the next century, should not be owned by individuals either. It should be owned by the citizens of India and by the public. And that creates a level playing field so that other people can use the digital highways. And you can think about multiple interpretations of this. There's, of course, the biometric ID. There is the digital locker, there's United Payment Interface, there's soon to come, health records and so on and so forth. And that's just the beginning. So the more we are able to equalize the playing field so that anybody who has been left out in the past has a shot at coming in, that's amazing. That is really wind in the sails. I was startled to hear a statistic the other day and pleasantly surprised that if you rank countries by per capita use of data, right, the kind of data that we pay for on our phones and so on, India has shot from being, 70 or 80 out of 200 a few years ago to being number one, which means more data being used per capita than the US or China, perhaps more than...
It also means everybody just watching silly videos, a lot of them. Right. I'm seeing a lot of
whatever
people,
it is,
yeah.
The point is that, the cost, the per unit cost of data is sort of going so low. Mathematicians say asymptotically close to zero. Right? So if you can have data being that free and that usable, of course you can watch cricket. We have the cricketers coming right after us, and more power to them. I think that's fabulous. And you can watch movies, and great. I love watching Bollywood movies on my phone too. But you can do other stuff too. So why not? So I think that's the plus side. The digital public goods, we've really gotten right. We've sort of leapfrogged the world, and I think we're just at the beginning of an exciting journey. What we're getting wrong is that we don't have the traditional public goods right. And what I mean by that is, getting the quality of basic education up, right? It's still stuck at low levels of literacy. We've got a right to education, a right to literacy. I forget what the formal name is. But I think our performance metrics on whether our kids can read and write and count and think formally coming out of the schools, I don't think are showing the uptick that they need to show. And coming back to China, the big thing that those guys did really well, going back 30, 40, 50 years ago, was get a system of primary education and secondary education that was simply fabulous and equally given to girls and boys, right? That we have not done right at all. That continues to be a problem and disproportionately a problem for relatively ignored sections of society, including women. So we've got to get that right, or we won't be able to benefit from the demographic bulge. And public health, we've got to get public health right. Our health indicators are improving, but there's still, so many that need to be addressed. We've had, 5 or 6 reports put out by various well-meaning people on universal health care in the last, since 1946. None of them have really been implemented. And we need to get a lot better at doing this. Basic stuff, basic education, basic health, basic investment in science, which again is something that is not quite a zero, but is very, very low.
You serve on quite a few boards. You travel the world. At this moment, what buzz are you picking up about the India story? There is one narrative which says that this is India's moment and that moment is now. There's another that you've got a country that's being divided increasingly and therefore, these negative forces will overpower any positive opportunity that stands before us. How do you see this?
So I think it depends on who you ask, right? You started.
I'm asking you.
No, what I meant is,
Sure.
you said, what am I hearing, right? And you said, what am I hearing as a board member or a businessman wearing that hat? And then I'll tell you what I'm hearing as an academic, because those answers are completely at odds with each other. What I'm hearing in the boards is, this could be India's moment. And goodness, I hope they don't screw it up, to put it bluntly. And in fairness, we've messed it up before. We've had the wind in our sails and we've not done it right. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed that we get it right. And as I say, I'm an India bull and I'm a glass half full kind of person. I do a lot of volunteer work here. I do pro bono work with the government. I believe in the story. People laugh at me, but I still carry my Indian passport, right, after 40 years. So I'm excited about that. But there is some trepidation in the boardrooms because the last thing you want is, invest usually in India and then find there is some retrospective taxation gimmick that somebody comes up with and says, we've got to go back and do this and so on. So, sanctity of policy response, stability of the environment, those are the things that promote investment. Everybody is keen to find an alternative to China. And historically, they've gone to, guess where, Vietnam and Bangladesh or places like that. But how do we get them to this time actually come to India? Again, I'm optimistic because I think the government is doing a number of things right. The digital public goods being one of them. Simplification of procedures being another to some extent, though there's still some ways to go. Promoting the India story in G20, which, our friend Amitabh Kant and others are out there doing very expertly. All that's good. As an academic, I would say that the other side of the story is more what you see on campuses, right? Because you've got people worried about whether everybody's views are freely expressed and expressible. And I think that's always been one of the strengths of India. You guys have been one of the strengths of India, the media, right, in some ways. So are all views allowed to be expressed in some ways? And I think we are a stronger country for that. So I hope we can recommit to that to the extent that we are steering away from it in some ways. That's what I meant by saying that depends who you ask. So you can ask me, I wear one hat or another hat.
One of the things you write about in your research is ambient trust, the aspect of how a lot of entrepreneurship in developing countries doesn't do well because of the lack of enforceable contracts, for example, the lack of institutions, an impartial legal system, credible regulatory bodies. Are you seeing that change fast enough?
The fast enough qualifier was a twist. Am I seeing it change? Yes. Is it fast enough? Obviously not. I'd love to see it change faster. No, it is changing for the better. When I look at my own students, whether they are of Indian origin or Chinese origin or origin from different emerging markets, there's a lot more circulation of talent around the world, which is nice. And the reason that exists is that they feel comfortable going back to their home countries, including India, and saying, let's contribute directly, let's build something. It's very hard to be an entrepreneur if you are in a sea of mistrust, right? Think about it. To build a business, you have to trust your team, the financier has to trust you, the customer has to trust you. And historically, the problem has, the sources of mistrust have been twofold. One is we don't have reliable, credible, verifiable information about somebody that we're doing something with. And the second is, if we do a deal and you don't behave the way I think you should, I have no recourse mechanism, right? Those recourse mechanisms and those information sources are becoming much more reliable. So to that extent, there is a level of ambient trust that allows me to partner with anybody. So in the US, I feel pretty comfortable dealing with anybody on an arm's length basis because I know that I can, to some extent, authenticate who the person is, what his or her background is, and if something goes wrong, I have some place to go to get some redress or get some recompense in some ways. To the extent that India and other countries move in that direction, as I laid out in the book that you were talking about called Trust, the Foundations of Entrepreneurship, so much the better. You'll see more capital coming in, you'll see more talent being unlocked. That's been a big thing, Rahul, in my work, is sort of trying to figure out how can we unlock marginalized talent. Very few of us are lucky enough to go to institutions of education or learning or corporations that have brand names on them. And therefore, people give you the benefit of the doubt when they start to deal with you. 99% of people are going to places that no one's heard from. But they're equally smart as anybody else. They could be there just luck of the draw in some ways. So I think one of the big things that I think about, whether it's in my academic work or in my writings or in my entrepreneurship, is how do we unlock this wasted talent? And a big piece of that is the gender discrimination that's historically been there. So, which is why it makes me so happy to be here in this.
I'm going to throw this open for questions as well. So if you have a question, please just put your hand up. And once we've established who's asking a question, we can do this. I want to spend just a moment talking about the funding winter and your take on it. In terms of how long do you think this will go on for? I'm reading contrary opinions. One which suggests that this will be short, sharp, and then there'll be a rebound. The other says that this is the new reality and that it's here to stay. How do you see it?
There's an opinion for every person, right? So my intuition, for whatever it's worth, is that we're in for, I don't know, at least when I look at the, so two sources of data. One is the immediacy of funding rounds that I'm going through right now in my own companies or as an investor through, I'm a co-founder of a large incubator in Bangalore called Axelor with the Infosys co-founders. So if I wear the investor hat or the entrepreneur hat, I would say deployment of capital is going to be slower for the next 2, 3, 4 quarters. But then I'm guardedly optimistic that it will start to come back soon after that. I don't think it's going to be much longer than that. That's just reading the tea leaves as I see them now.
We've seen with SVB a lot of concerns now around how deep is the systemic risk to the banking sector. Also, Credit Suisse being just taken over. What's your reading of what's at play and potential implications for the Indian ecosystem?
Well, I think it's a wake-up call to banking systems all around the world, right? Which is in an allegedly well-run banking regulatory system like the US, if Silicon Valley Bank was allowed to do the kinds of things that it did, obviously there were failures of governance at multiple levels. And these have been adjudicated in the news media and soon in the courts for some time now, since the crisis emerged, the fiasco emerged. I think that just says that there are other weak financial institutions everywhere. And if you look at the regulatory institutions in India, India's financial regulators are pretty strong. SEBI is pretty strong compared to those in other emerging markets. But it would be hard to say, but it's well known that our banks have had NPL problems and that we've been trying to deal with it for some time. So the sooner we can get, we meaning the regulator, the central bank and others, can get a handle around those and perhaps cordon off those risks in some ways or put in place more stringent governance to some extent, I think that would be a good thing. But SVB, I think, is a cautionary note because it could happen anywhere when you let your guard down.
What do you make of the kind of guardrails India has got going? There's so many stories that Business Today has done, the others, that the Indian guardrails are much stronger than what's allowed in the US, and therefore the chance of an SVB like blow up in India is lesser. Do you buy that or not?
Which guardrail is stronger?
Just the fact that regulatory caps are such that you're forcing banks to be more prudent than SVB was, for example.
You know, the regulator has a tough job, right? It must be said. I mean, there are so many judgment calls. If you tighten the guardrails too much and you make it almost impossible for banks to lend, well, then you'll dry up the flow of credit in the economy, and the downside of that is also pretty stringent. I'm not a regulator and I don't have direct experience, so it would be foolish for me to second guess ours. I would just note that there's a real trade-off. And the SVB thing is a very sobering thing because it's an institution that had a unique role to play and it played its hand in a rather cavalier fashion. And what's worse is that it was allowed to play its hand in a cavalier fashion by its board and by the regulator about it. And now it's emerging that lots of people were warning it about it, and they chose not to do something about it. So, I take some I draw a serious lesson from it, which is that we shouldn't be complacent about the governance.
Okay, I'm going to take some questions from those who are here. I'll start with Saurav Majumdar. Saurav, you have a question? Can we have a mic up front, please, so that we can have some questions being asked? Yeah, just bring the mic here.
Professor, you said you're associated with Axelor as a co-founder. Now, when you talk to younger entrepreneurs who are coming out and wanting to set up their ventures, given the kind of problems which some of these large storied startups have faced on the governance side, what are you telling them and how are you preparing them for better governance? Because that's become a serious cause for concern, as you know.
It's a very good question, and thank you, Saurabh, for asking that. At Axelor, we take very seriously good governance. No compromises. No compromises. And I think the trick to that is just having a very measured investment process, very measured. You used the term guardrails before in a different context, very, very concrete guardrails. Systematizing itself, again, it's a judgment call. How do you systematize the process of nurturing youngsters to be entrepreneurs, which is an exhilarating and also scary journey for anyone, without squashing their creativity in some ways. It's a tough balance, but I think we've achieved it pretty well, at least over the last 8 to 10 years that we've been in existence. I would, going back to the comment, Rahul and Saurabh, about talent that is not directed to our biggest problems, and you asked earlier about some of the weaknesses. If you look at our entrepreneurship ecosystem in this country, it is disproportionately focused on important areas, but limited areas. Cloud computing, mobile phones, IT services, stuff like that. The vast majority of opportunity is left out. We're starting to see some enthusiasm about ag tech. There's very little medical device innovation that's going on. There's almost nothing in the space sector. There are 1 or 2 new sectors that have come up. There's nothing on fundamental biology. Pretty much all the big buckets, scientific buckets that I can think of are left untouched. That is something that is only going to be unlocked if we as a society get behind, to put it bluntly, scientific literacy and make a big push. Take some pretty amazing entrepreneurial successes in the world. We've heard of Moderna, which is in my backyard in Cambridge, Massachusetts, the mRNA company. Moderna is basically funded primarily by grants from the state with a little bit of risk capital laid on top. Take SpaceX. SpaceX is basically funded by NASA contracts and guarantees with a little bit of risk capital laid on top. They're both in the tens of billions or hundreds of billions of dollars of market cap. My point is very simple. Those are, of course, outlier successes. unless the state gets behind enormous public money in R&D, which we are not doing at all, we cannot generate anything other than Me Too ventures. So we need to get out of that. At Axelor, we're fortunate enough to all be later in our careers and not worried about the immediacy of payoffs. So we're trying to take the long view and say, how do we really nudge the entrepreneurship ecosystem in the direction of really fundamental innovation as opposed to Me Too copying in different ways. Time will tell, but I encourage other people to get in on the action.
Siddharth Zarabi, the managing editor of Business Today Television. Can we have a mic sent up to him, please?
Thank you, Rahul. Professor, India's and women's position in business has been linked to culture and the past. But we are now talking about the startup age. In your own experience and working with people, how do you think Indian women are doing now in startups, given that they do pretty well in STEM?
They're not doing as well as they should. And I don't think that's on the women. I think that's on society. I have one of my students sitting next to you, Shweta, who is an entrepreneur building a talent agency, Talarang, which I encourage you to look at. But we need to find the Shwetas in India and encourage them. And that's a societal task. And going back to the very first question that you asked me, Rahul, a few minutes ago, about the fundamental things that we need to do to get with the program when it comes to AI and genomics and so on, is we need to embrace all forms of talent. And a big portion of that is women. So I don't think it's on the women that they're not doing as well. I think it's on all of us, on society, to find ways to create the mentoring networks. And by the way, that's what her startup is about, creating the mentoring networks in some ways for underappreciated talent. So it's on us, all of us, and we should work on it because the payoff is pretty large. It's a good, as a financier would say, there's a very good IRR on this.
Anand Adhikari.
Professor, Indian economy is largely a services sector economy in terms of contribution to GDP. Will the manufacturing or the services sector, which will be impacted most with the AI tools? And second, I was reading somewhere about, UK government, recently they came out with a paper for regulating, AI tools. Do we need regulation, to regulate all AI tools?
It was hard to hear the question. I think you said, does AI affect manufacturing or services more?
Yeah.
And do we need regulations? Is that correct?
Which will be impacted most, manufacturing or the services?
Well, in the short run, because we have more services than manufacturing, then services will be impacted more, most likely. Because, all the AI tools are based on systematically and systemically collected data, which I think is far easier to do in India in the services sector, which has been run in a far more professionalized manner and at scale. So if the data sets are available there, that's where you're going to see the impact of this sooner. But that's a very different question from where should we see the impact, right? This goes back to, again, the very first comment that I made. The AI revolution is based on pre-existing data sets. If the pre-existing data have been constrained by the constrained experiments that we've run in the past, so if we've only run services stuff, if we've only had stuff that's built by men, you're going to have data sets that are biased in those directions. Your lessons are going to be reinforcing those past biases. So we've got to really step up and do things about that, again, as a system. It's not going to self-correct in some ways. On the regulation, that's a tough one. I think all of us are struggling with it all over the world. I don't think there's any clear answer. It's clear that that we are going to need some form of guardrails, but I think I would be a fool to pretend that I know what those were at this early stage. We'll have to see.
In the research that you do on leadership to last, you interviewed the likes of Adi Godrej, Ratan Tata, Kiran Mazumdar-Shaw, Rahul Bajaj, and many others. Do you want to share with everyone sitting here your key lessons on what is it that takes to build organizations through leaders who can leave a legacy that lasts?
So Rahul is referring to, there's a project that we run at Harvard Business School called the Creating Emerging Markets Project. And I encourage you to just Google that, Creating Emerging Markets, HBS. and you will see about 200 hours of free video, iconic video of iconic entrepreneurs around the emerging markets of the world, many of which have never been seen before, that we are developing gratis for people to use in exploration and teaching and so on. Why is that? Because, frankly, I got tired whenever somebody in Boston asked me, or if I asked somebody, who do you admire as a leader? They would all say Bill Gates. And I said, yes, that's good. Bill Gates is indeed admirable, but there are many admirable people around the world. So we started shooting these videos over the last 10 years, and the videos are free and available to anybody. But in that video, we have about 200 hours of video. I would say a good 40 to 50 hours of those videos are from India and South Asia. And a good 30% of those videos are of women. And this is iconic women leaders across the spectrum, all over corporate India, some of whom you would have heard of, most of whom you would have heard of, some that you might not have, across the social sector. And through all this, the central message that comes through, that if you want to build something, so this is sort of the flip side of building a unicorn. I'm all in favor of building a unicorn. I built a unicorn. It's really fun. I recommend it. But that's not all there is in society, right? This is about people who have reached a far higher order of excellence, in my view. They have changed the direction of societies. Whether it's Brazil, it's China, it's India, Indonesia, South Africa, Egypt, you name it. They've changed the direction of societies. And women are centrally featured in that, despite all the discrimination of all this. The central lesson that I take away, Rahul, from that is that all these leaders really display an empathy, and I mean that in the broadest sense of the term, a sort of sharing attitude. So of course they generate wealth and they generate social surplus, but they are very, very careful to take everybody along with them. Again, I think it's a lot easier to say, I need an exit in 7 years, and I'll make a few tens of millions of dollars, and I'm all set, and that's true, and more power to you, especially if you get some jobs going. But it's a different order of success in my mind if you can do something that lasts the ages. That's what I aspire for. We'll see if I deliver.
Okay. We'll take a couple of more questions. Dinesh Bhatia, the Group CEO of the India Day Group, has a question, so we're going to take that. Okay, we're going to go to hers next. Yeah, go on.
With so much risk capital available and focus on startups, do you see legacy businesses which are largely self-funded and a bit more judicious in their investments? Do you see their life cycle contracting, or they being left out in a sense, or do you see them competing with risk capital funded ventures?
I hope their life cycle contracts.
Really?
I hope so, and because that would be an indication of efficiency, of allocative efficiency in the economy. I mean, you want new enterprises to, if they're doing something right, you want them to outcompete old enterprises so that society's resources get better allocated. If you have the same entities running day in and day out, it's not a sign of dynamism in the economy. And you started off by saying, with so much risk capital, can I correct you for that with due respect? There isn't risk capital. That's the problem. We don't really have a venture capital sector in this country because very few VCs are really taking risks. True risk capital is able to price intangible assets. We don't have that as yet. We have pockets of it. We have risk capital in the form of individual angels. But the minute you have a real, VC, venture capital in the sense of taking long-run risks pop up, they realize that they can make more money by being sort of a later stage private equity fund, and they move kind of up the food chain and begin to do safer investments. So this is actually the reason I'm belaboring it is that it's a very fundamental point. In the US, we're lucky enough to have real risk capital. So you'll see people taking bets on ideas that don't have the prospect of return for 5, 7, 10 years. mRNA took 20, 25 years of research to pan out. So the real risk capital is needed. We don't have that in this country yet. We need to find ways to do it. And the state needs to de-risk the process to make it possible for risk capital to do its job, neither of which is happening yet. So it's correctable, but we need to identify the problem before we can solve it.
Okay, you had a question? Just bring the mic here, please.
Thank you. My question is, you said we've seen recent reports suggest that women's participation in workforce is falling now more recently. Also to what Siddharth sir said, we don't have enough representation. You also mentioned that there's a parallel between Bangalore and Silicon Valley when it comes to underrepresentation of women. How do you think this would be solved if it is such a rising problem?
That's the, we talk about India going from a $3 trillion to $10 trillion economy. I think half of that is addressing that problem. Right? If we don't address it, we're not getting into a $10 trillion economy. I don't know is the short answer, but I think each of us can play a role in it. That I'm pretty sure of. Certainly at the institution that I'm at Harvard, we spend a lot of energy, much more than I've seen spent in any of the boardrooms here or in any of the universities in this country, trying to do something about gender parity. Trying. Not always succeeding, many times failing. And sometimes those efforts take 10, 20, 30 years. I don't even see that effort happening here yet in an institutional sense. And I think that's on us. It's on the men in the room. It's also on the women here who are privileged enough to be here. Right? So this is a collective social problem. It's not on any individual person. What I do know is that it's going to take a long time to fix. And again, I think it starts with primary education. I had a wonderful, short 30-minute conversation right before I came here with this lovely lady, Shaheen Mistry, who is the founder of, a woman entrepreneur, founder of Teach for India. Just a fabulous, she came by and we chatted for half an hour about, mutual experiences. And that's what she's trying to do, is change people's attitudes at a fundamental level across thousands of schools in the country. What I'm trying to do through the government is, I had the good fortune of writing a report back in, 2015, that resulted in something called the Atal Innovation Mission, which is a formal part of the government now, anchored in Niti Aayog. And one of the beautiful experiments that we've unfolded within that is these things called tinkering labs. You can Google it, Atal Tinkering Labs. Those are 10,000 little, I would call them scientific play areas inside high schools all over the country. Poor areas, rich areas, private schools, public schools. I think we're going to go up to 100,000 of these, 100,000 schools. That's going to change the way kids play with science, including girls. I mean, what could be cooler than that? I mean, I can't imagine. I mean, if we get that done, I think we should clap for the government.
In the different capacities in which you serve, advising the government, how seriously do you think this government takes your advice in terms of giving good suggestions and those suggestions actually getting accepted and implemented?
So it's a mixed bag. It's a mixed bag. But I have to say that the ratio of things that I've tried, the ratio of things that have been implemented to those that I've tried is pretty high in this government. Look, I'm not a member of the government. I'm an outsider trying to volunteer my time. And I recognize that it's a complicated system. There are many interests. There are many points of view. So I don't expect all the ideas to be taken. But I've seen a very nice receptivity, at least I only work on these technological, education, entrepreneurship issues. And I've seen good receptivity for whatever it's worth.
Of the reforms the government has implemented, and then some of which have been pulled back, take farm reforms or land acquisition bill, what's your sense of how systemic these reforms are to power India's growth into the future? We are headed into an election year. Does that, to your mind, really slow down any prospect of the government making meaningful reform in the next several months?
Show me electoral democracy where that is not the case. It's got to matter to the electoral, competitive realities that certain kinds of reforms will be probably deferred. That said, I don't know enough about the individual reforms. The agriculture sector really needs work, a lot of work. I mean, so much of our workforce is still in the farm sector. Productivity is pretty low. Historically, the way that societies have developed is unlock talent in the farm sector that migrates to the urban areas, that starts getting productively deployed in services and manufacturing. And that chain is not working in India, has not worked for quite some time, to the extent that we keep propping it up with farm subsidies of different sorts. That's not good for society. We need to have a fundamentally different way of working on it. But as we saw with the Farm Bill and the response to it, I remember, flying into Delhi and seeing all the protests and so on for so many months on end. Look, you need talented politicians to get around those kinds of things. But there are reforms that I think the government is looking at that are promising. There are others that I wish would be taken more seriously.
Like which ones?
Do something about public health. Anything. Do anything about public health. Raise the budget. Invest in public science. You cannot become a middle-income country without significantly more investment in public R&D, period. You can hem and you can haw and you can do everything else. Without public investment in R&D, it's, as we say in Hindi, khalas.
That's right. You're in Mumbai using terms like khalas, which is fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor Tarun Khanna. This has been a fascinating start to our event this evening. We appreciate you taking our time and joining us here at the Business Today Most Powerful Women's Conference. Really appreciate this. Thank you, sir.
Such a privilege to be here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.